Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. I'm Wenxing from Taiwan National Human Rights Museum. I'm also the moderator today. This is the third session of 2021 Migration and Human Rights Forum series. The topic is combating slavery. The speaker today is Father Peter Nguyen Van Hung, Director of Vietnamese Migrant Workers and Immigrants Office. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Father Nguyen. Before we start, let me give some introduction to our new friends here. We started this forum series last year, and so far we have invited different NGOs, museum practitioners, and scholars and experts as our speakers. For example, we have invited Serve the People Association from Taoyuan talking about migrant workers' situation in the pandemic, and also Brilliant Time Southeast Asian Bookstore's curator talking about female migrant workers' perspectives in showing their stories. We've had also the Garden of Hope Foundation Migrant Service Center talking about female household migrant workers' difficulties. And also this year we've had Taiwan International Workers Association talking about foreign fishermen prisoner situation. Last month we had Taiwan International Family Association talking about amendments to the Nationality Act and some unfair treatments of new immigrants in Taiwan. So we've had these different speakers who talk about human rights and migration from legal, human rights, and the real situation perspectives, and also they share their practice and advocacy experience. They let us see how NGOs and museums have used different approaches and methods for everyone, for more people to understand this topic. After each session, we also put the recording video onto our official website. So if you want to revisit this forum, feel free to go on to our official website. Before we start, I'd also like to explain our procedure a little bit today. Our forums are held once every month, each time 1 hour. I'm the moderator for some opening remarks, and then the speaker will talk for about 40 minutes. And at the end, we will have 5 to 10 minutes for Q&As. For you to ask questions. So now you can use the chat box on the upper right to raise your questions. After the presentation, I will sort through the questions for the speaker to answer them. We have simultaneous interpretation service, so if you want to listen to English, you can select your language floor at your lower right and then select English. So now let's move on to the topic today. In 2009, Taiwan passed the Human Trafficking Prevention Act, and since the past 11 years or so, Taiwan has been ranked by the State Department of the U.S. as a Tier 1 country in terms of global prevention of human trafficking. This seems to be a brilliant result, and indeed, the act has been very fruitful. Actually, behind it, there are many decades of efforts of a lot of organizations and a lot of frontline aid and assistance. And very importantly, it's not that Taiwan no longer has any human trafficking cases. Actually, there's a lot of room for improvement, and we still need to take this issue very seriously. Now, human trafficking has morphed into different forms, and they tend to be masked and packaged by seemingly legal behaviors, such as kickbacks and brokerage fees. And human trafficking doesn't necessarily mean being threatened by force or imprisoned, because the general public tend to have the misconception of a perfect victim, and they tend to ignore the structural and institutional suppression and the fact that legal institutions tend to be the hotbed for modern slavery nowadays. We're so honored to have Father Peter Nguyen Van Hung with us today. Father Nguyen has been a bit unwell recently, but he hasn't forgot his promise with us. This is why he's here today to share his decades of experience in combating slavery. Now, let me introduce you to Father Nguyen. He once received the Trafficking in Persons Report Hero by the State Department of the U.S., and he's deemed as a hero ending modern slavery. Since the 1980s, he has helped victims of human trafficking and advocated for the legislation in Taiwan, leading to the passing of the act. His office, Vietnamese Migrant Workers and Immigrants Office, still keeps more than 10,000 of cases. Today, he's going to explain some real cases and the reasons behind modern slavery. Allow me to remind you that these real cases involve vocational injury and domestic violence, so some photos may seem a bit graphic to you. So if you feel uncomfortable, feel free to turn up the image while keeping only the sound. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Father Nguyen. Please, Father Nguyen. Thank you.
Trafficking in Taiwan. During the timeline, I was here in Taiwan in 1988. At that time, Taiwan still listed as the first class in fighting human trafficking. However, when I went to visit detention centers and prisons, and I have met so many people who from China, from Asian countries, and then I was really shocked. And then I came home. I came back to my office, and I tried to find out what is it. Is this just exploitation, or is it something else? And then, coincidentally, I had a friend from the U.S. I talked about this with her, and she told me that this is about human trafficking. And then I looked up in the United Nations definition of human trafficking, and I see exactly what is happening here in Taiwan, in the center, and in the life of migrant workers, especially the Vietnamese here, the Vietnamese migrant workers and immigrants here in Taiwan. So I suppose that you are familiar to the United Nations definition of human trafficking. So it is about being controlled, being coercive or threatened, being bonded, being treated inhumanly, and being exploited. So that if anyone who has been in this kind of situation, I can see that it's very suiting the UN definition of human trafficking. Now, talking about exploitation, I would like to go back to the issue of broker fees to let you know about the what had happened before, but until now has not yet much different. A Vietnamese factory workers before coming to Taiwan, they have to pay 5,500 to 8,000 US dollars to work in a factory. For a fisherman, they have to pay 3,000 to 6,000 US dollars. And for domestic and workers and caretakers, they have to pay 1,000 to 2,000 US dollars. And similarly, because they don't have money, therefore they have to deposit land, they have to deposit houses, and then they have to borrow the shark loans from brokers so that they themselves would be able to borrow sufficient money to come to Taiwan. And this is the way I see it, as bonded, as controlled. However, there are many people who disagree with me about this. And from my argument is that it is bonded because the people or migrant workers who come to Taiwan to work, and because of they pay this much amount of money, therefore they have no choice of choosing other work. And then later in today's presentation, you will see that there are so many horrific pictures of those, because they cannot choose their employers, cannot choose your type of work, and therefore they lost many parts of their bodies. So that is to make a person to become a victim of human trafficking. Broker system here in Taiwan contributed a big part of that. So the broker system here I'm talking about now is about in Vietnam. Okay. Now, how about the broker system here in Taiwan? A broker in Vietnam cannot send any Vietnamese migrant workers to Taiwan. No, they have to work with Taiwanese broker system, broker companies here. And then I heard that 1/3 of the amount they get from the workers will be kept in Vietnam, and then the rest will be sent to Taiwan. So that the brokers in Taiwan and in Vietnam will work together. So to send the workers from Vietnam to Taiwan, and then in Taiwan, the broker in Taiwan will control, coerce, and then if the worker asking any questions and disagree with the broker, they will repatriate the workers. And then other issues about raping, torturing, and exploitation is also happening. And I will share with you about this in the next in today's slide presentation. Here, as you see the picture here of a man. So he is one of the brokers here in Taiwan and located in Tainan. His name is Hong Ming-yi. He himself has worked with his father, who owned a big piece of land in the mountain, and then he imported around about more than 100 young Vietnamese migrant domestic workers to Taiwan, and then he and his father systematically drugged and raped more than 100 Vietnamese young women. And let me see the next slide. Okay, and then I go back to the slide because some of the slide has been removed, I think. So and then in my office at that time hello.哦，好。在各位刚刚所看到这位先生，他是一个中介公司的主任，他的中介公司是在台南。他和他的父亲在大概3年以内，性侵害了100多个越南的家庭帮佣。那因为这个案件， 所以呢，我才那时候建立我的办公室，然后我办公室接手跟法福基金会一起来帮忙这个案件，然后这个案件最后被起诉，但是当他被起诉的时候，找不到人。好，这个是一个很明显的证明是中介公司在台湾很深刻的介入这个人口贩运哦，人口贩运。好，那一讲到人口贩运的部分，那我们讲到他这个移工在台湾工作的状况的时间的状况哈。如果他是在一个 factory 在工厂工作的话，每天工作12到16个小时。那在我当时帮忙这些案件的时候，大部分的他们的做那个加班费没有他们雇主就不会付给劳工。现在一讲到这个12到16个小时这个事情，其实现在在台湾还是继续的发生哈。然后呢，然后雇主为了限制劳工，所以他们不。
So the gentleman you see in this photo is a director of a broker agency, and this office was located in Tainan, southern part of Taiwan, and his father has raped more than 100 Vietnamese domestic workers in 3 years' time span. And because of this case, I was motivated to establish the office. And we also work with legal aid to help these victims. This guy was prosecuted, but he was nowhere to be found when he was prosecuted. So this is an obvious example of a systematic broker agency system that enforce human trafficking in Taiwan. And when it comes to human trafficking, I would like to talk about the overview of the status of migrant workers. For a migrant worker working in the factory, he or she has to work 12 or 16 hours per day. And when I was working on these cases, there was no overtime payment available. When it comes to 12 to 16 hours of working hours per day, this is still a dominant phenomenon in Taiwan. And the employers, they confine factory workers and they confiscate migrant workers' passports and national health insurance card. So how do they do that? When these migrant workers arrive in Taiwan, the brokers, before they send them over to the employers, they would ask these migrant workers to sign a lot of documents. And one of the documents is a consent form consenting to give their passports and national health security card to the employers. However, these migrant workers would not know what they signed indeed. And so for 1.5 of their so every month the broker would deduct 7,000 to 8,000 from their salary for the first 1.5 years. And that was one of the methods deployed in a lot of nursing homes in Taiwan. The brokers would ask these money to be deducted directly from the payout account of the employers. And also, the interest from these deposits were collected by employers. If the migrant workers disagree, and then they will be repatriated. And the word repatriation would generate fear in migrant workers, and then they would be totally at loss, because when they are going to leave their hometown to work in Taiwan, the entire village would congregate to congratulate them, and they would have already borrowed a lot of money from the bank. That is the main reason why they would be exploited here in Taiwan. The picture is a Vietnamese domestic worker. Her employer refused to pay her salary. And one day the employer's son asked her to go over to the son's house. The employer's son told her that he would like to have sex with her, and if she refused, then the son would refuse to pay her the salary, so she rejected. So the son of her employer was pissed off. So he pushed her to the ground. So she got hurt. That was why she was wearing this brace. So when she came to us, we helped her and asked the employer for damage compensation. And this is another case of another employee, of another worker who was denied safety protection gears, and that was why he got hurt. And the employer refused to pay the damage, and also he was about to be repatriated. So he came to us. This is another gentleman, and who suffered occupational injuries. When he came to our office, he said that he knew that it was tremendously dangerous to operate these machineries at the factories. He told his employer and said, "This is too dangerous. I don't want to operate these machines." But the employer threatened to send him back to Vietnam. And he has already sacrificed a lot. He could not go back. So he had no choice but to say yes. And therefore, he suffered this occupational injury. And when he was injured, the employer refused to give him medical care, and he came to us, so we supported him. It's the same for this gentleman over here. So for caretakers and domestic helpers, it seems that things have not changed much. So these domestic workers were hired here in Taiwan to take care of people. And a lot of them would be confined at employers' houses. And during the day, when the employers sleep through, and in the night, how should I put it? They have to work through the night. And if the employer sleep through the night, and then during the day, and this domestic worker has to work in the employer's relatives' houses. They had to clean houses, and they probably have to work 3 households at a time. It's they have to cook for the entire families. In addition to taking care of the invalid, they also have to take care of the children of the employers or the grandchildren of the employers while they are doing a lot of house chores. And they were denied access to their cell phones. And if they talk to their fellow country people, employers would be very mad. They would accuse these domestic workers of misconduct or wanting to do some mischief. So these Vietnamese domestic workers, they have to do lots of house chores, and in addition to that, a lot of them were raped, and a lot of them were repatriated. So from 2004 to 2007, there were a lot of Vietnamese domestic workers who were raped and sexually assaulted. I asked those victims that they have already borrowed a lot of money in Vietnam, and they were so afraid of being repatriated, and therefore the employers exploited that vulnerability and took advantage of them. And those domestic workers, well, the situation remains unchanged. Their ARC and also their foreign residence certificates and passports and also national health cards are still confiscated by the brokers or employers. And it's the same. Another domestic worker suffered occupational injuries, were repatriated. For me, when it comes to labor exploitation, the salary is a really good illustration of the situation. Currently, for domestic workers, the salary is 17,000, and before it was 15,840 NT dollars. And that's 15,840 NT dollars for domestic workers. Some of these amounts go to cover their national health insurance. And while they are still in Taiwan, back then, the Vietnamese government would deduct a tax from their salary as well. Therefore, we need to understand the situation, and the question is, why would they still their salary would still be deducted for tax payment, and on a monthly basis that $3,000 would be deducted from their salary, and they would call that as a pre-deposit. For most of the domestic workers, if they cannot take it anymore, and then they would probably run away, and that money will be confiscated. So when it comes to factory workers, domestic workers, fishermen, what we are observing right here is the salary condition.
So they usually have to work for 1.5 years and 2 years before they can really pay back the brokerage fees in Vietnam. So, and at the time, they could only work for 3 years in Taiwan. So out of those 3 years, 2 years work had to be used to pay back the brokerage fees, and they could only earn money for themselves for 1 year. As you can see now on the slide, not a lot of money was left for these migrant workers. This is also part of the labor exploitation that I want to talk about. A while ago, I told you about this already. And these people, when they work in Taiwan, they worked a lot and they sent back money to their homes in order to pay back the brokerage fees in Vietnam. If they complained in Taiwan about being exploited or being abused or being raped, if they complained at all, if they told these things to others, then they would be repatriated. I think this kind of institution is also labor exploitation and coercion. These people constantly lived and worked in fear. And, well, how should I put it? They lived in fear and in anxiety. To me, this is also part of labor exploitation, and this is also part of labor exploitation in my opinion. Now you can see on this slide a young lady. You see that her left hand is deformed. She worked in Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan, and this was her occupational injury, but the employer, the company, didn't compensate for that. And the employer stopped her employment immediately. So she escaped, and she went to my office telling me about her situation. And we in our office helped her with this situation. Now, and this is also another case, as you can see now on the slide. This gentleman, he was only 20 and 21, and he had to went into the mountains to work. And this is also a vocational injury case. His work was dangerous, but he didn't have any other choice. So to me, the fact that they don't have any other choice is part of labor exploitation and bondage. If they hadn't had to pay for such expensive brokerage fees, they wouldn't have suffered from such danger and stress. They could have chosen not to work in such a dangerous situation, but in fact they couldn't, because otherwise they would have been repatriated. So there are many similar cases in my office. Now I'm going to tell you about one specific case. This is obviously a case of human trafficking. And starting from this case, our office decided to focus on this issue and challenge the institution. The name of this case is Dao Zichun, and he was only 18 years old. When he was in Taiwan, at first he was only 17. Why could he come to Taiwan at the age of 17? Well, because in Vietnam, he bought a birth certificate and he made a passport in Vietnam in order to come to Taiwan. When in Taiwan, he worked as a domestic worker, but after that, this person was brought to a company, a building, and this case was a lady, and she worked on the first floor of the building, and she was hurt and injured, and then the broker agency didn't allow her to eat at all, and then the agency threatened her, saying that she would be repatriated back to Vietnam because of her injury. And then this lady was very nervous and very anxious. So physically and emotionally, we could see that she suffered a lot. This is her picture, the victim. You see that her hand is injured. She was an operator. And you can see that her fingers were hurt from her work. And you also see some other injury on her body here. This hand, as you can see, actually this is the skin that you see now comes from her leg or her foot. And now you see that, well, this one is different from the previous picture. So different parts of her body are injured. She went to a hospital, Mingshen Hospital, for her treatment. The doctor in the hospital didn't ask for her opinion before the injury. The doctor made his decision on his own, and when she went to my office, we could see that she was very painful because her hand hurt a lot and her foot hurt a lot as well. And she had to undergo some skin implantation, and nowadays she still feels very uncomfortable with these different injuries. So it was obviously a labor exploitation case. When I was helping with this case, I contacted her family, and her mom told me this: I cannot sleep at night. Before her daughter came to Taiwan, the mother told me that she used to have very beautiful legs, feet, and hands, and the mother very often hugged and held her beautiful hands. But now, the mother said now that the hands and feet are full of scars. I cannot help but feel the pain. The mother was very painful upon seeing the scars of her daughter every time, and the mother said that it was like stabbing her and tearing her apart. And she said, I cry for her pain, I cry for her future. The mother also said that she cries for her future. This is the daughter of this young lady. What the mother told me. This is another case, which is also obviously a labor exploitation case. Her name is Miss Tom. She was 21 years old, and she worked in a company as an operator, and there was an occupational injury. She, as a result, lost 4 fingers on her left hand. If I remember correctly, the fingers were cut by the machine. The employer refused to send her to the hospital because the employer said that the hospital fees were too high, and as a result, Miss Tom got infected. She came to my office to seek help, and then we sent her to a hospital. It was Chang'an Hospital, and Chang'an Hospital treated her. So now you see this picture. 4 fingers were infected, so the fingers had to be cut. And the hospital, what the hospital did was to cut the 4 fingers away. When I was helping with this case, Ms. Tom said that when I was injured, the employer did not give me food to eat, and they didn't ask me how I was doing. What was the mentality? I think the employer probably treated her as a slave, so they didn't really care for her. They didn't care for her situation. So in these cases, you see that when these migrant workers worked, they suffered from occupational injury, and the employer didn't help them, and they didn't pay. They were not willing to pay for their treatment. This is another case, which is also occupational injury, and it was in Tzu Hospital in Hualien. I went to Hualien, eastern Taiwan, to help the victim. This is another similar case. This person, the dad, was only 18 years old. He was only in Taiwan about 6 months before his death. He paid $7,000 for coming to Taiwan.
He was dispatched to a construction site. and he fell off from one of the construction sites, and he lost his life. So these migrant workers, they fall prey to slavery, and now the Vietnamese brides, or now is called the new immigrants in Taiwan. But back then they were called Vietnamese brides. A lot of these new immigrants, they came to Taiwan through marriage, and they were married to Taiwanese men. And they were married to those men who were unable to find wives in Taiwan. So they were married to men of a lot of issues. Even though they were married with these men, but a lot of people would say this is like a transactional marriage, because to have a bride, you pay 10,000 US dollars, and then you can actually find a Vietnamese girl to be your wife. And they come to Taiwan to satisfy their husband's sexual needs, and then they were forced to give birth to babies, and they would be subject to domestic violence, confinement, to coercion, and even some of these girls were auctioned off. So this is a very infamous case in Taiwan. This is Duan Yatling. After she was married to her husband, well, her husband was already married before they were married. So her husband, the husband got a divorce in order to get another Vietnamese wife. And then she has to take care of the entire family. And the former wife, who was jealousy of her, and she beat her up and left her on the street. And this is another case of human trafficking. And this falls into the category of sexual exploitation. These Vietnamese girls, Vietnamese women, they come to work in Taiwan, or they are married to a Taiwanese man. And then where did they stay? They stayed in taxis. And they work a shift from 10 p.m. to 7 o'clock in the morning. And this lady was controlled by the broker agency. And this is just another similar case. These pictures you see now on the screen are of similar experiences. Like she came to Taiwan in the name of marriage, but her husband was a psycho, and she was forced to live in a crazy family, and she was admitted to the hospital. So someone reached out to me to help her, and I got her out. And within a week, gradually she regained her sanity, and she told me her story. And when I heard the story, I knew immediately that was a very typical case of sexual exploitation. As I told you before, these Vietnamese women came to Taiwan in the name of marriage or work, but this is actually another news in United News in about Jinmen. So it was about 400 Taiwanese men gathered to select Vietnamese brides. So when I read the news, I looked into the case to see whether this is sexual exploitation or human trafficking case. So this is another advertisement around 10 years ago. If you did pay attention, you would see a lot of advertisement of this kind, especially in mountain areas. It would be found in like mountain routes. This is another case of labor exploitation. Back then, in Taiwan, there was no regulations available to help these victims. So the new law further victimized the victims. So the new law further exacerbated the severity of their circumstances. So to summarize the presentation, those are just the tip of the iceberg of all the cases I have helped and handled. So they were mistreated and abused. And I would see them as victims of human trafficking because they were bonded. But a lot of people disagree with me because they were thinking of the definition of slavery. So they would sort of copy and paste the circumstance of an old era to a new era, and for them those were dead only. But in 21st century, my definition of these situations qualified as human trafficking and slavery, and that is exactly the broker system in Taiwan does, because they are bonded in this and trapped in the situation, and these people had no choice. And when they came to Taiwan, they were abused, they were beaten up, and they were put in hazardous situation to work. And they physically suffer abuse, and they also mentally suffer abuses. So what they would like to reclaim is their human dignity. But when these victims demand for their basic human rights, the brokers and the owners, most of the time, the brokers are the evildoers. They would send off secretively these victims to airports and repatriate them. Now at the airport, we have a station set up by the Ministry of Labor, and that measure was encouraged by NGOs' efforts. That was the result of NGOs' alliance and efforts. And we have also asked the Ministry of Labor to amend and change the relevant regulations about repatriation. And they have to first verify and validate the repatriation, because a lot of times in the past, the brokers would secretively send off these migrant workers at the airport without the proper procedure of validation for the reasons of repatriation. So I would like now to conduct a brief analysis of the issue. So things have not changed much because poverty remains. And poverty is not just about lack of money. Poverty also reflects itself in knowledge. And when it comes to poverty, I would like to talk about the system. So the poverty is reflected in values and economy. And the system itself is still a corrupted system. And from that corrupted system, a broker system was produced. And both in Taiwan and Vietnam, these broker agencies were spun off by a certain type of company. So the government would delegate certain authority or power to these broker agencies. And because these poor people, they want to earn money, so the brokers would talk to the poor in Vietnam, in central Vietnam, and then they would advertise for job opportunities in central Vietnam. And those poor people hear about the news, they would be very excited. And then when the broker would ask them to pay them money for that job opportunity, so the information is actually solely controlled by brokers. So there is a lack of transparency of information. In order to make the money, that the poor had to pay the brokers, and then the brokers in turn can actually share the benefit with the government. As I told you before, the obstruction of information is the result of the concerns of the broker agencies, because they're afraid that if these people know the working conditions in Taiwan, they would not want to come to Taiwan because they have to work like from 10 to 14 hours per day, or 14 to 16 hours a day, and then they would only start to earn money after 6th month. They would not want to come to Taiwan. Therefore, when these people first walk into the broker agency, they would ask these migrant workers to sign piles and piles of documents, because that would take them too much time to read all these documents. Then, under the pressure of that high demand for job opportunities, these people would be anxious because they could not afford to be choosy, or they could not afford to go through the documents in detail. Otherwise, they may lose the opportunity for a new job overseas. So they would pay the broker agency a big chunk of money, and they were totally in the dark.
And these broker agencies in Vietnam cooperate with agencies in Taiwan, as I said. When it comes to knowledge, we have to say that these people, they don't have self-confidence, self-esteem, self-assurance, self-respect, and they also lack self-awareness. So all of these constitute knowledge. And in Vietnam, for them, family is very important. So, because of that, these families teach children some wrong knowledge and understanding. For example, they have to sacrifice for their family, or they have to fulfill filial responsibility for their family. Because of such culture and such social expectation, because of all these factors, these migrant workers at the end become victims. And because they are victimized, in order to solve this problem, my office, along with other NGOs, have participated in many activities and protests showing the issue to the Taiwanese society. Between 2004 and 2006 and 2007, maybe at the time you didn't hear a lot about human trafficking, because at the time human trafficking was very rarely mentioned in Taiwan. This was one of the activities that I participated in. I was in this protest at that time. This was another protest. This was in cooperation with Van's organization. And this activity, this protest, highlighted the situations of these two victims. So we all participated in this activity together. When it comes to human trafficking, when we talk about human trafficking, when I started to pay more attention to this issue, I decided to cooperate with other NGOs, and we had meetings with the government. And every time the Taiwanese government said that we would put human trafficking into the Immigration Act. At the time, there wasn't an immigration agency in Taiwan yet. During those meetings, I often said that I wanted to have a dedicated act, because if this issue was put under another law or another act, it would be considered as less important. So, but at the time, I think the government was hesitant. So, finally, I and some other NGOs like the Garden of Hope Foundation and also Taipei Women's Foundation and Legal Aid. We worked together, we made a lot of efforts, and in January 2009, finally, in Taiwan, we have the Human Trafficking Prevention Act passed in Taiwan. Before 2009, you can well imagine that before 2009, the situation in Taiwan was very difficult because we didn't have this act available before 2009. I personally believe that empowerment is a very powerful and important thing. The empowerment of oneself, and then the empowerment of oneself leads to the empowerment of others. I often mention this to the migrant workers coming to our office. I have kept encouraging them, including this lady that you see on the photo. Even though her injury was very serious, she made a lot of effort to learn the Chinese language, and once she had an opportunity to talk with President Chen Shui-bian, and as you can see here on the picture, it was helped by the Legal Aid Association. So at that occasion, she gave that bouquet of flowers to former President Chen Shui-bian. So basically, let me propose one solution, what we can do in Vietnam. When I have a chance to go abroad to advocate, I often talk about these points, but so far, these cannot be done yet because the Vietnamese government don't trust NGOs because they cannot control the NGOs. If we do such things, we will for sure get arrested in Vietnam, and we will get sentenced in Vietnam if we do these things. So far in Vietnam, there isn't democracy yet. Vietnam is not yet a democratic society, so we cannot yet do these things in Vietnam. In the past, I tried these approaches via some churches in Vietnam to do these things, trying to push for some social activities, but it was very dangerous. And as for in overseas, previously I went abroad a lot to advocate these issues. In 2005, I received the award from the State Department of the U.S. as a hero in combating human trafficking. I think that represents our contribution, but at the same time, that was also a good opportunity for me to go abroad to advocate. And when I did that, I received a lot of support from Vietnamese associations and organizations. And because of such pressure, the Taiwanese government became more cooperative in facing this challenge with us. And at the end, in Taiwan, in 2009, the Human Trafficking Prevention Act was adopted. I think that was a very good thing indeed. So let me conclude here. I believe that does labor exploitation still exist? The answer is yes. There are still 13 cases of labor exploitation in my office, and there are also cases of sexual exploitation as well. What should we do in this situation? I think we can only keep working. Even though we already have the Act of Human Trafficking Prevention, but the Act hasn't fully unleashed its potential and function because in Taiwan, it seems that the judiciary institution is still not very familiar with the Human Trafficking Prevention Act because there are fewer cases, relatively speaking. So the judges often dare not issue sentences, concrete sentences. So I think in Taiwan, I have also participated in Human Trafficking Prevention Alliance. I hope that in Taiwan, in the future, now and in the future, I hope that in Taiwan, human trafficking should be paid more and more attention to by the Taiwanese government. I think there are nowadays many related campaigns and education on the part of the Taiwanese government, but such cases continue to emerge. I think the government now doesn't have a high enough control over the brokerage system, so there's a lot of bondage and coercion cases in Taiwan. And in Taiwan, the brokerage fee institution remains the same. In our office, there are cases in which each migrant worker has to pay $6,500 before coming to Taiwan. And in some cases, they only come to Taiwan for 1 month before the contract is ended. And what should they do to pay back the very high brokerage fee? Such high fee becomes a high burden for their life. In order to solve this problem, I believe that the political system in Vietnam has to change. Vietnam has to democratize itself. And I think in Taiwan, I think the situation has gradually changed and the government has really made an effort in cooperating with NGOs and organizations in combating human trafficking. I think this ends my presentation today. Now, maybe we still have some time for question and answers. Thank you, Father Nguyen, for your very insightful presentation. And we feel very heavy-hearted after listening to this presentation. The reason why we established this platform is because we need some space and a place for such stories to be heard by different parts of the world. On behalf of the organizer, I'd like to say sorry because of time constraints and because of the fact that we are already delayed a little bit. We have to almost end the activity. I haven't received any comments or questions. We have a friend from Indonesia saying that there's a good idea. We can perhaps organize some teams to go to Vietnam to understand this issue better. I think this is a very good opinion. We can also think about how, for example, maybe during the pandemic, there are geographic constraints, but we can still do something, especially such problems continue to exist. In the interest of time, we don't have time for Q&As anymore. If you have any feedback about the speaker and about the forum, please email me. You may have noticed that Father Nguyen's cell phone kept ringing because a lot of friends, a lot of people need help from Father Nguyen, especially many Vietnamese migrant workers try to contact Father Nguyen very often. Finally, just to remind you, our next forum will be at the end of April. We will have Mr. Hu Jiaming from National History Museum. Next time, he will talk about how museums can use art, culture, and exhibitions to allow people to understand Taiwan's migrant workers' history and human rights. So I look forward to seeing you again online. This ends our forum today. Thank you for your participation. Bye-bye.